I've been working at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, which is responsible for flying the unmanned space probes past the planets. The work I do here primarily involves creating animations of what it would be like to ride along with the spacecraft as it goes by the planets. I go about it in a fairly methodical way, simulating light reflecting off of surfaces and the geometry of objects in space for perspective and so forth. This is what artists around the Renaissance were concerned a lot with, being able to do more intuitively, but there's a lot of art involved just in the programming itself.
I call myself a visual music maker, and that means that I take music, listen to it, and transpose it into its visual equivalents. The technique of computer animation, the technique of electronic animation, the techniques of videography. Those are tools just like paintbrushes are to an artist who paints on a canvas or chisels with a chisel and a hammer for making sculpt, only I do it with cathode ray tubes and photons and electronic imagery.
My name is Lowry Burgess, and I'm an artist, or at least I'm called that by many people. Although much of my work disappears, it's dissolved, invisible, it's exploded. And in fact, that's very consistent with much of the drift of art since the Second World War, that it places greater and greater demands upon imagination, upon the empathy, upon capacities that really are not tangibly or physically present. Part of that general extension also has been the rapid increase of the use of high technologies and science by artists in their work. The tools and assembly of materials and energies which expand the possibilities that the artist has in the studio. Most conspicuous of these new tools is the laser, the computer, and holography. All of these give the artist the potential to move into a new studio, a new kind of laboratory.
This film is now going to take you to several of these new studios. We'll begin with the New York Institute of Technology, which has experimented with and created some of the most impressive of the new computer art pieces, and which created the new Nova opening you have been seeing this year.
New York Institute of Technology has, for the past 5 years, been trying to apply digital computer technology to the problems of animation. This piece, animated by Paul Heckbert, attempts to overcome some of the limitations of the human face. Of course, to make images like this requires millions of dollars worth of computer equipment. But it also requires some very imaginative people. And it's this human imagination that's really the focus of the thing. In the same way that human calculation was hastened first by writing instruments, then by the slide rule, then by adding machines, and finally by computers, computers are now being used to extend the human visual imagination. And that's what these pictures really represent.
fascinates me about computer graphics is that while I've always been interested in the visual arts, with a background in mathematics and engineering, until recently I haven't been able to express those interests. Computer animation gives me the most direct route from conceptualization to visualization. It lets me bypass the use of my hands in traditional artist materials. I'd like to show you some of the techniques that I've used in a recent production for the new opening for the Nova show. One of the first jobs we had was to produce the image of the galaxy which you see up here. The first step in that process was to find an image of the galaxy. We use this one here. The next step in the process is to put that image in a form that the computer can understand. The first stage of this process is to convert the photograph into an analog signal. To do this, we use a standard television camera that scans the photograph from left to right, top to bottom. It converts the information into an electronic signal which is analogous to the brightness at each point that it scans, hence the term analog. This signal is sent downstairs to a special computer that measures the signal 10 million times a second. These measurements are then converted into numbers or digits, which are stored in the computer's memory. Once the photograph is in this form, the computer can understand it and manipulate it.
This board is full of microchips. Each chip contains 16,000 switches. It is the process of turning these switches on and off that all computers have in common. Each switch represents a single bit or digit, and hence the process is referred to as a digital process. This particular device is a frame buffer. It's a device that makes a computer graphics facility different from other computer facilities. At one end, the frame buffer looks to the computer as a standard computer memory, but at the other end, it looks to a video monitor or a tape recorder as a video signal. It allows us to translate the mathematical representation of a picture into a visual one.
What we're looking at here are individual pixels blown way up. When we go to videotape, they're actually much smaller, as there are 250,000 on the screen at any given time. The representation we have of the galaxy now is two-dimensional, that is flat, just like the photograph we started out with. The effect we wanted in the opening, though, was a three-dimensional trip through the galaxy. And to do that, we had to describe to the computer the position, the size, and the brightness of 40,000 stars. To accomplish that, I wrote a program that looked at each and every pixel in the photograph. If it saw a bright pixel, that indicated that the photograph was bright and there were a lot of stars in the original galaxy. So for that section of the galaxy, we made a lot of stars, we made them bright, and we spread them apart. If the pixel was dim, we made fewer stars, made them dimmer, and clumped them closer together. Once we have the three-dimensional description, we can ask the computer to draw the galaxy from any position in space. And if we change that position smoothly from frame to frame, we've created a piece of animation. Another computer programmer at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Jim Blinn, has done some amazing simulations of the Voyager flybys of Jupiter and Saturn.
Each frame of this movie was made by a computer. In order for a computer to make pictures, it has to divide the picture up into a lot of little spots. As we zoom in on the picture, you can see each spot show up as a little box. There's 480 boxes up and down and 512 going across. Now, for places where we've been, we can get mathematical data for the shape of the continents of the Earth or photographs of Jupiter. But for places that we haven't been to yet, we have to paint in a hypothetical background, a hypothetical map of the surface. And for that, we use what's called a painting program. This program simulates the painting process, except we're painting directly into the computer's display memory instead of on real canvas. The colored spots at the bottom of the screen are the color palette. And you can see the little white spot of light moves left and right as I move the pen left and right, and moves up and down as I move the pen up and down. The computer can keep track of where the pen is. And there's a little click switch in the tip, so that when you press down on it, it starts leaving a trail of color behind. select different colors for the paintbrush. And you can change the size of the paintbrush. Large paintbrushes are good for painting in large areas. Around with this thing and make all sorts of interesting pictures, just freeform. The actual purpose of this thing, however, was to make some hypothetical maps of various of the moons and planets we hadn't been to yet, so we can make simulations of what they might look like when we got there. In order to put a map on the surface of the sphere, we have to define the map in somewhat the same way we do the picture. It's an array of spots with a color for each latitude and longitude on the surface of the planet. And once we have that defined, we can have the program refer to that as it's scanning out the picture of the planet. Essentially, for each spot on the screen, it's figuring out what latitude and longitude is visible there, looking that up on the map to get the color, and then testing that against the light source to find out how bright to make it. And one other way of putting texture on a surface is to simulate wrinkles and bumps, which in the case of planets shows mountain ranges. In order to do that, you have to describe to the computer the altitude of the surface at each point. It's a different sort of texture. Instead of color, it's the relief. And when you make this sort of picture, you get the shadowing and the highlighting effects of where the mountain ranges are. Now, all these programming tools can be used to make the pictures you've seen here, but the creation and the processing of images can also be used to good effect for just purely artistic purposes, which is what has been done by the artist David M.
Well, one of the really remarkable things about the programs that I use to make these images are that you can generate shaded textured surfaces, and in particular, you can generate them with extreme detail, as the sphere here, which started out as a very simple, smooth shaded sphere, and now we've put a fairly textured surface onto it. Well, we can take the textured sphere and we can put much more complex arrangements into it so that we can actually compose images that aren't simply descriptions, but are actual creative compositions in the sense that fine arts are. There are a lot of textures that could be made, and maybe we should go to a very, very simple one to get the idea really clearly, such as a grid. So if we take this grid, we can very simply put this grid onto a surface as well. Which is reading in at the moment. So here we have a sphere again, but instead of the previous texture, we have the grid that we just looked at. Now, there's a lot of things that we can do once we start with a texture, and so I've used this grid texture in a lot of different compositions. And so what we'll do is now take a very different kind of picture and see what the same basic information that the computer is dealing with does when instead of throwing it onto a sphere, I decide to map something more along the lines of pyramids. We can take the same texture and come up with a completely different look and set of possibilities. You see the little white sphere that was in the previous image is here too, and so you can get a totally different kind of look from it. So we go back to the color map we had a minute ago, and using again the grid texture, but a completely different kind of picture, we come up with this composition. Now in this image, I've gone ahead and taken this image, and by focusing in on one part of the picture, like the central portion here, I've been able to do that and use that in yet another image. So what I've done is taken the completed picture and used that as a texture that shows up in the spheres in this 16-part picture, which is composed of sequences that can be animated. The computer medium can duplicate many of the characteristics that other media have. It works a lot the way painting does. It works in its three-dimensional capabilities a lot the way sculpture does. It works in terms of animation a lot of the way that film does. But it's none of those things. It's like painting in the same way that painting is like sculpture. They share many similarities, but they're really not the same thing. The computer gives you expanded capabilities in a great number of ways. As I said already, it gives you the element of control. You really don't have that fine a control in any other medium, but it also gives you tremendous choices. It lets you choose from almost an infinity of colors that you can have on the screen at any given time. And it lets you manipulate those colors in many, many ways. It lets you join together many different disciplines so that, yes, you can paint in a single image that you have in the frame buffer of the computer, and then you can come in and do very sculptural things that are dimensional. And then you can come in and do things that are quite truly architectural.
I have never indulged myself in the process of digital technology as yet because I've been working all these years, 4 to 6 years now, just getting the craft of analog, videography, and electronic animation down. I enjoy that process of analog, working with video and real-time machines, because I can see it. And when I'm through with an editing process after 8 hours, I've made something. The process that I have to use is one that demands upfront. I record where I'm going. It's like filing a flight plan. And that means that I have to spend a lot of private time to devise the look of the landscape. Now, I use the word devise only because the process I have to use is called image scripting. I have to very carefully image script and storyboard, which looks something like this. This is a book of approximately 50 or so pages of images that were created for the visualization of the Prelude in Love, Death. Each picture is part of a map that shows me where I'm going to go and helps me decide how I'm going to do it.
not very surprising sounds are the second piece of computer music ever produced. I wrote the little tune, and I saw it through the computer with the help of Max Matthews, who started all this. I was, at that time, around 1960, Executive Director of Research, Communication Sciences Division at Bell Telephone Laboratories in Murray Hill, New Jersey. And Max Matthews was head of the Behavioral Science Department. He worked on the processing of speech, and he also was very close to psychologists and people in the general field of acoustics. And we investigated all aspects of sound and were drawn into this very peculiar new aspect of sound, sounds generated by computers. A lot of people have been intimidated by everything that computers do, including the making of music. Indeed, that's what kept good composers away from computers for a long time. And in part, perhaps it's what keeps people away from the music that is produced. Another thing that keeps people away from the music is that the people who have done the best work with computers are contemporary, if not avant-garde musicians. They aren't composing in the tradition of Beethoven or even of Berlioz or later composers. They're composing something that to them is new, using a new means to do new things, and the new things are unfamiliar. They aren't the things that people have heard and have become familiar with. John Chowning is an incredible person. His background was entirely musical. He spent a few weeks at Bell Laboratories, went back to Stanford, got in touch with the computer people, and somehow got a full-fledged project going. He invented a new form of sound synthesis called FM synthesis. He has found out how to make sounds fly around a room. He is just a man with limitless energy and limitless ideas.
One of the earliest projects that we worked on in the domain of computers and music, beginning back in 1964, was a program that allowed us to move sounds in an illusory space based upon the fact that we have 4 loudspeakers and with a rather extraordinary control over the signals that are applied to the loudspeakers via the computer technology. This is a program which represents in 2 dimensions a listener space with loudspeakers at each of the corners of this square. Presumably the listeners are within the square. The idea is to provide a kind of freedom for the location and motion of sounds within an illusory space which is not bounded by the walls that we normally find ourselves within. I'll play an example in which we'll listen to a bit of a piece, Tyrannus, which is about 10 years old, where this pattern occurs in the initial moment or two, and I'll point that out. This is a sound that's moving in this rather complicated trajectory, and on the screen, we see various functions which are derived, which are to control the relative amplitude between speakers, Doppler shift, the overall loudness of the signal having to do whether it's close to us or far away.
One of the great problems of computer music is the audience. You can scarcely ask people to go to a concert hall to hear a tape played or a computer perform. Will they listen to it on records? Not if it isn't on records, and although records have been printed, it's essentially not on records. Will they hear it in the films? This is my great hope. A friend of mine, Andy Moore, is now employed by George Lucas to make wonderful new sounds which may occur in films. Well, anything is acceptable in a film. And if the computer music is good, this is its real chance with a large audience.
Part of my main impetus for being in this field is that I've combined my favorite pastimes, that is fiddling with technology and fiddling with music. And this is a dream come true. It's a chance of a lifetime, I feel, for building the kind of music-making system that we've thought about and that we've known could be built for years and years and years. This is the first time that I know of that anyone has gone into developing technology in the arts in this scale very seriously, for exactly the purpose of bringing the arts into the 20th century, or at least into the second half of the 20th century. The machinery that we're building here, at least in my group, is tailored towards processing of audio, processing of sound, and we're using computer-like equipment. If you'd like, I can show you some of the materials we're working with in this. This is the parts cabinet where we store all the integrated circuits. These are the fundamental building blocks of all modern computers. All computers these days use circuits like this. These circuits perform many different functions. Some are memory elements, some are arithmetic elements, some are logic elements storing data, some are used to transmit data from one place to the other. These circuits are installed in circuit boards like this one here. Then they're interconnected by wiring on the pins on the back of the panel here. Once the circuits are wired together, the boards are installed in a cabinet such as this one here. This is the one that we're using that holds 8 different boards. This particular one opens up because this is an experimental device and we need to be able to get at the insides of it at all times. The boards are then connected together by cables such as this one, which attach to receptacles at the edge of the boards. In addition, we connect the device to things in the outside world, such as computer terminals or tape recorders or whatever, via cables also, different kinds of cables, but cables nonetheless. Sound is fundamentally a vibration, a pressure wave in the air. In normal music or normal electronic processing of music, what happens is that we attempt to encode the pressure of the air in terms of an electrical voltage. We all know how this is done. Or maybe we don't know how it's done, but we certainly know that it happens all the time. We have an electrical wire that goes to your speaker in your hi-fi system. And what's going through there is a voltage that, if all is working well, is proportional to the sound pressure level of the sound at that point, the music at that point. Well, what we do with the computer is exactly the same sort of thing, except we have devices, again, integrated circuits, called converters, that measure instantaneously the voltage on a wire and produce from that a number representing that voltage. This is done very, very rapidly, 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 times a second. They're like snapshots, repeated snapshots, each one of which is a fixed picture, if you will, or measurement of the voltage at that point. And when taken together in a stream, they produce the illusion or the effect of a continuous moving sound or moving voltage, which is an analog of the sound pressure wave. And that's how we deal with sound in the computer, is in terms of these numbers, which are snapshots or frames of the sound pressure wave. What I'd like to show you is just an example of some of the things the computer can do. And the example I have here is dealing with the human voice. What we'll play is a recitation of a poem, and then the computer synthesized version of that same poem. And what we've done here, we haven't modified the speech in any way. It's just the original recitation and the synthesized version.
So graciously you yield, thankful for every caress, for for every word.
Now the synthetic.
So graciously you yield, thankful for every caress, for every word.
Again.
So graciously you yield, thankful for every caress, for every word.
Synthetic.
So graciously you yield, thankful for every caress, for every word.
The piece I'd like to play for you is composed of 3 sounds. There's a recitation of a poem by Brodigan, recited by Charles Shear, and there is a live flute. Tim Weisberg, the flute player, was very kind to donate several minutes of music to us. Now, what I've done is I've taken these two and I've produced a 3rd sound, which is a cross between the flute and the voice. It's this wispy, willowy sound that's actually mouthing the words of the poem. And now.
We stopped at Perfect Days. We stopped at Perfect Days and got out of the car. The wind glanced at her hair. It was as simple as that. I turned to say something.
In everything we've seen up to this point, there's one common tool, which is the computer. The computer, to me, is not necessarily a very new instrument. It's very much like a cathedral organ, which we all know very well. We see the organ master sitting at his console, playing the keys and pulling the stops. And what he's really doing is interrupting the flow of air through the chambers into the various pipes to produce a wondrous variety of sound. Just as the organ master sits there, so we see everybody at their keyboards, essentially interrupting through the computer the flow of electrons to produce wonderful images of light and sound, new things for our eyes and ears. To stick with the cathedral image, there's another thing in the cathedral which was absolutely new in its time, which was the wondrous stained glass window, which through the purity of light and its power in the dark space had a great capacity to excite wonderful images inside us. Likewise, we have a new instrument, another new instrument, a laser, which has this extraordinary purity of light, which fascinates everyone who sees it, just the light itself. So we have finally this very bright light, and just as the stained glass window was a surface on which the play of sunlight could happen, so the hologram becomes a surface on which the laser can play. Light consists of a wide spectrum of very, very active energies. all the way from the most active violet down to red, which is the least active but still very active. Now, laser light chooses a very, very tiny, thin, narrow range of light. And what's been very hermetic about holography in the past is that it required that little, thin, narrow laser light to be seen, and both to be made and to be seen, so that holograms could only be seen if you had lasers. One of the major innovations that came along was with Steve Benton at Polaroid, when he invented a means of seeing a hologram in white light, in light that you could have in your house or in sunlight outside. And this opened a floodgate of possibilities in holography.
This piece of glass is actually a white light hologram called Crystal Beginning, which we originally made in 1977 as a kind of spatial test pattern, but people seem to like looking at it too. Now you can see how the white light is broken up into a spectrum so that as you move up and down, the color of the image changes. And the image is also three-dimensional, so that as you move from side to side, you see the shift between the front and the back parts of the image. We can also make holograms of actual objects, such as this hologram of some apples. Now, it's actually 3 holograms in one. So as you move from side to side, you'll see bites appear in those apples. We designed white light holograms so they could be viewed with ordinary sources of light, like a spotlight or sunlight or an electric light that you could buy in a hardware store. All these lights are spread out over a wide spectrum of all colors. That's why they're white light. But 10 years ago, we had to show holograms with lasers, which have all their light concentrated into a single color. Now, lasers are expensive and difficult to work with, but they do give some pretty impressive images, like this hologram, which we made with Fritz Goro a few years ago. The images can be very sharp and deep and so realistic that people actually try to reach out for them. White light illumination turned out to be even more practical because anybody could set up a hologram in a museum or a gallery or their private collection. Now, all these holograms are printed onto a very high resolution photographic emulsion coated on these glass plates. But that's where the analogy to photography ends. So let's go in the lab and I'll show you how a hologram really is recorded. Now, the hissing noise you hear is coming from some air bellows that we had to put under this very heavy and rigid table, because although our holograms can be viewed with white light, they all start with a laser exposure, like this one. And that means that everything has to stand extremely still for several seconds during the exposure. And the plate's held over here, the object is clamped down here, and illuminated with a laser beam coming from over there. Now, let's talk about the laser beams for a second. Now, the beam starts from this end of the table, where it comes along and is split into two and comes back together for the exposure, as we'll see in a minute. The beam itself is coming up through a hole in the table from the laser, which is under here. The laser produces a concentrated beam of purely single-frequency light, unlike an ordinary light source that spreads out a beam of white light which has lots of different frequencies in it. And it's that purity that makes hologram recording possible. Now, I don't normally blow smoke on laser optics. But this should help you see where the beams are going. Now, most of the light is going down this way, where it'll expand to illuminate the object, the chessmen in this case. But part of the light has been split off over here and is going around, and it's expanding here to reflect off this mirror and go down to the plate directly, where it overlaps the light reflected from those chessmen.
Now, here the light is expanding. It's going over to illuminate the chessmen. And the second reference beam is coming down directly to hit the plate. And it's where the light from the objects and the reference beam overlap that the holographic recording is made and the information is recorded on the plate. But there's nothing on the plate that looks anything like a chessman until you illuminate it in just the right way. And to understand that better, I'd better draw you a couple of pictures. Well, let's look at a really simplified version of what we saw on the laboratory table. Starts out with the laser, just putting out its concentrated beam of light. And here we put a beam splitter, which reflects most of the light down to a mirror, which is going to put it through a lens to spread it out and aim it at the object, which are the chessmen over here. So those waves are expanding and get reflected back in a kind of broken up form towards where we're going to put the holographic plate with its very high resolution, slow speed emulsion. But that's not the only light that's going to expose the plate, because that would just produce a fogged plate. So we put a mirror up here and beam the rest of the light towards the plate, expand it with another lens. So it produces another set of waves, which we call the reference waves, which overlap the waves from the object. And where they overlap, they produce an interference pattern, very fine, dark and light fringes, perhaps 25,000 of them to the inch. And that's what produces the exposure in the holographic emulsion. It's much too fine to see with your eye, but when you expose it and process it, you have the hologram. Now, if we take that hologram, put it back in place after processing it, and re-illuminate it with those waves that came from the laser, from the same direction and angle that the reference beam originally was, that recording in the emulsion diffracts those waves and reproduces exactly the waves that had been scattered from the object. So that if you put your eye there, the lens in your eye will focus an image on your retina, and you'll see the object just as though it were still there behind the plate, reflecting that light. Now, that's a pretty abstract concept. Well, what it means is that if you put your eyes here, they focus the image, and you see an extremely realistic three-dimensional image of that scene floating behind the hologram, just as though it were still there as it was a couple of hours before. If you move around, you see a different perspective views. Your two eyes see the stereo pair that you need to get a three-dimensional view. And if you come right up to the window, the hologram, you see through just that small part of it that's in front of your eye, and you see the entire scene from that particular perspective view. And you can also use that small area of the hologram to project that view of the hologram of the scene in front of the hologram, as I can show you on this slide. Now here's a hologram being illuminated by two separate laser beams from the top and the bottom. And from the top, it's projecting the view of the scene from the top. So we see these letters, for example, over the top of this hoop. But down here, the laser beam is projecting the view from the bottom of the hologram, so we look through the hoop to see the letters. And it's this ability of a hologram to project different perspective views from different parts of the hologram that makes it possible to make a white light transmission hologram. To make a white light transmission hologram, we take that hologram and illuminate a narrow horizontal strip of it with a fan beam of light so that we project images not onto a screen but to a second holographic plate, which we record with a second reference beam from the same laser. And because this image contains all the right to left eye views, it contains all the information we need in order to see 3D. But that's a lot less information than then was on the original laser hologram. That means that we need a lot less coherent light source in order to view it. So we can use a white light source like sunlight or spotlight, and that makes it a lot easier to see these holograms. My feelings about 3D are very intense and personal, and it's just it's something that once you've gotten bit by it, I think you're stuck with it for the rest of your life. There's a 150-year history of people who've felt that way, and they've done a lot of good work, which we're all building up from.
I'm Harriet Kasdan Silver. I'm an artist based at the Center for Advanced Visual Studies at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I've been there now since 1976. I like to say I'm an artist first and a holographer second, because I feel that if I weren't working with holography, I would be working with some other art medium. I've worked with various holographic systems. This is one of my white light transmission holograms. It's called Equivocal Forks 2. Let's look at it. You can see this hologram, as you can most holography, from side to side. There are particular angles of view, and you can change your angles, see different versions of the imagery. The forks come in and out for you. Also, you can see this forks plate from way back down the road. As you walk into it, it changes. It will change color as you change your angle of view moving into it. That's up and down. And as you walk directly into the light will start to swim around your head, so you feel enveloped by the hologram. Before the white light equivocal forks, I did a series of laser transmission equivocal forks, which is usually the way you work toward a master that will make the white light. Now, this is something that I would like to show to you. I particularly like the laser. Let me turn the laser on. The laser has an element of fantasy, of mystery, elements that white light don't give one. Also, it adds some definition to the imagery. Voila, equivocal forks laser version.
Wonder what I have here.
I'm Lowry Burgess, and I'm a professor at the Mass College of Art.
Yeah. What are you doing over there?
The class that's assembled here is a group of graduate students from the Master of Fine Arts program. They're all participating in a group called the Graduate Seminar, in which we discuss issues which are common to all of us in our work.
Now, in recent times, the last 150 years, we as a culture have essentially evolved a very powerful, elaborate technology that maybe is more extensive than most other cultures, but certainly reaches out. The reason why I brought all these things here today was to show you that my perception of technology now is that it's beginning to go into a phase where it comes to wrap around our body to create a new kind of garment. We see plenty of people jogging around with these things on, you know. This allows us to listen to great distances if we wanted to, the edge of the universe. We see people out watching birds like so, you know, in the morning. And we see also this rather elaborate new piece of jewelry, the camera, which hangs around everybody's neck. All these things, including the computer wristwatch and the elaborate arrays of things that people wear electronically, combine to make a new fabric, a new garment around us. And to me, this is a new dimension of technology. It's coming to be much more like clothing and much closer to our skin.
Do you find that these new technologies have almost a kind of magic to them, almost a magical quality?
Tremendous magic. You know, we can place our eyeballs on the rings of Saturn. We can put our ears out on the edge of the universe. We can make our hands reach down into the atomic structure or the DNA structure. So this wonderful magic that appears is staggering. The question is, what ends are we going to put those powers to? And are they going to serve life-fulfilling goals in some way? For some people, my artwork is difficult. I create objects which I bury, or send into space, or sink in the ocean. So much of what I have done cannot be seen. I can only describe it. But what I hope is that by telling people about it, I will have etched a vision of it in their imaginations.
For 13 years, I've been involved in one single work called the Quiet Axis, which involves a wide array of technologies in a very, maybe difficult but strange and I think wonderful work. It stems from a vision I had in 1968 of an inclined lake in air in a place called Bamiyan in Afghanistan, high up in the Hindu Kush. The origin of the vision of the inclined lake was from my deep despair over the events in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War, and what indeed was it that I could do that might begin to lay a basis for some other understanding. And it was one particular time when I was most disturbed, and I walked out on my porch one evening and asking, what is it that I can do? And looked off toward the sun in the evening and saw a lake of water sloping in air as clearly as could be, with water lilies blooming on its surface. And the problem was, how can you make water slope in air? And how can you make a work that has the ethereal quality of a vision? And it was the ethereality and the mirage-like quality of holography that could give me an appropriate embodiment for the vision and give me the means to go actually do the work. So what I made were a series of 12 plates of holograms of water lilies and stars. And the water lilies were in very deep darkness. And each water lily was blooming at a different angle, a different sense of width of bloom. And above the water lilies was a plate of the stars above the earth. And beneath the water lily was a plate of the stars beneath the earth, one plate for each month. So it's as if you took the stars from this side of the earth, stars from this side of the earth, and compressed them together around the image of the water lily to make a plate that would be compressed such that almost the earth had vanished. And to take these plates then up to the high valley and to bury them along a 1.5 mile axis.
Bamiyan is high up in the Hindu Kush region of Afghanistan. I came here with my family to complete my work, and I made a film document of it. I came to bury my holograms in the desert, in a pattern which would form an imaginary lake. I wanted to create an image in the mind of a hovering lake poised in air over the sand. You know what a hologram looks like now. I want you to be able just to imagine this one, to make it come into your own mind. For everyone, the hologram, the image, will be different and personal. As people find out about different fragments of my work, through films or lectures, what I hope is that they will be able to create for themselves an image to resonate in mind. The new technologies are leading us into more illusionary spaces. Holograms hover in space behind a dim photographic plate. Computers give us music or pictures which are really but numbers stored electronically in the computer's memory. All these instruments create images which are remembered in our mind when they disappear in the world around us.
The material on this video cassette is protected by copyright. It is for private use only, and any other use, including copying, reproducing, or performance in public, in whole or in part, is prohibited by law.